It's the most wonderful time for book recommendations. It is time for the winter book rec bonanza. I got Kara from Wild Book Garden. She was looking for young adult, and middle grade, I believe. Sorry I slacked on the middle grade. But I do have 2 young adult novels and an adult novel for you. She was looking for fantasy, contemporary, or historical fiction. And I do have, I got your fantasy covered and I got your historical fiction covered. I don't have your contemporary covered, I'm sorry. And then some things that she wanted in these books are slow burn romance, bonafits, it's also hate to love. I don't have that covered, I don't think, in any of these books. Well, kind of. Not really. A little bit, though. Then we have opposite of the chosen one trope, i.e. more ordinary main characters. Got you covered on that front. You'll see what I mean by that. And we also have traditionally feminine female characters who aren't ashamed of it. I got you covered there. And finally was fairy tale retellings. Fairy tale retellings was what I wanted to recommend you the most of because I love retellings, but I don't know any fairy tale retellings. So I have some other retellings for you, and I hope you like them. So without further ado, let us get on to the books that I'm recommending. The first book I'm recommending is actually an anthology, but I'm recommending a specific short story in this anthology, even though all of the stories in this anthology are great, and that is Every Shade of Red and All Out, the no longer secret stories of queer teens throughout the ages. So, All Out is a collection of short stories that are queer historical fiction, essentially. Sometimes there's a hint of, like, fantasy thrown in, but it's mainly just historical fiction. And the one that I want to recommend to you, Every Shade of Red, is a Robin Hood retelling where Robin is trans and him and Will Scarlet are in a relationship. And it's real good, y'all. It's so good. I have mentioned it before on this channel, I'm sure. But that was like a while ago because I read this in 2018. So, I highly recommend All Out in general, but specifically I recommend that Robin Hood retelling because it is just amazing. So, All Out, young adult, historical fiction, bam! We got one out of the way. It's also a retelling, but it's not a fairy tale retelling, but it's good. Next, we have The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. So, The Silence of the Girls is an Iliad retelling. It's actually an adult book. It's adult fiction. And it's adult historical fiction. Because it's an Iliad retelling. So, basically, if you aren't sure what the Iliad is about, it is basically the story of the Trojan War. I'm going to leave it at that because there are some plot points that I usually would mention in my description of the Iliad that are in here that I think would be really cool if you actually didn't know what was going to happen before going into this book. So, I'm going to leave it at that just in case. Anyway, Briseis, it's told from Briseis' perspective. I'm not sure if I mentioned that already. But Briseis is Achilles' war prize. So basically, she's a slave. And so with that territory comes some rape scenes, which made me a little uncomfortable, but I am not triggered in any way by rape. So if you are, maybe not the best book choice, but if you aren't, it's really good. It's really good. It's a feminist retelling of the Iliad. Like, it's Greek mythology. You know, it's good. And I really want more people to read this book because it's such a good book. But, yeah. So, if you aren't triggered by rape in any way, I highly recommend this book. So I recommended you some young adult historical fiction. I recommended you some adult historical fiction. And now it's time for some young adult fantasy. The book I am recommending is Tarnished Are the Stars by Rosie Thor. So I actually just read this book earlier this month. It's set in the future in a very steampunk world, but the catch is that all of this technology that they're using for like mechanical hearts and stuff like that is like outlawed. So it's kind of like, ooh, yeah, we can't, we gotta do this in secret because the government doesn't want us to use technology because it takes place on a new Earth and there's no technology allowed because technology is what killed the old Earth. So there's that. It's really cool. And I recommend this book specifically because it has a female character in it who is feminine and not ashamed of it. She wears her dresses and she's not afraid to stab a bitch. It's quite good. And so there's also a sapphic romance in here that is kind of a slow burn hate to love, but also not really at the same time. It's not like a traditional hate to love. It's not really a hate to love, honestly, but the circumstances are like, oh wow, this should be a hate to love. So, it's like kind of there. But yeah, and then there's also an Aero Ace boy who I would die for. So, I mean, what more could you want, really? But yeah, so this is just a really, really fun book, honestly. So those are my 3 books. I mean, I really hope you enjoy them. I'm sorry if, like, they're not as good of recommendations as you were hoping for, but I really wanted to recommend you some fairy tale retellings. I just haven't read any. Because I'm not a big fairy tale retelling person. I love other retellings. I love Greek mythology retellings, and I love, I liked that Robin Hood retelling. So, I like retellings. I'm not a huge fairy tale retelling person. Let me know if you do end up reading these books and liking them. I would so appreciate that. So I hope you have a very Merry Christmas, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.